Okay, we're going to go ahead and finally start our study on the book of Nehemiah. It's been, a month or two since we finished Ezra. The expectation is to go from Nehemiah here to Esther, and we will have done these three books that really detail around the exact same time of events. But let's go ahead and open with a word of prayer, and we'll begin with our study in Nehemiah. Father and Lord, we thank you this evening for the fact that we can come together. We thank you for this nation that we have and the fact that we have the freedoms, at least at this point, that we can, without fear and reprisal, we can open up your word, we can study it. We don't have somebody that's overlooking us and keeping us from speaking the truth. And let us use that opportunity to share the truth and share it boldly. And Lord, as we study this specific book, we know it has to deal with the history of the nation of Israel. Just help us to glean from it the things that we should, and to just rejoice, one, that we have your word, but two, that it encourages us to take faith and to the rest of the things that you've had to say, whether it was to others or specifically to us. And so, Father, just bless this time and this study that we have. In Christ's name, amen. Okay, Nehemiah. I guess it would help if I went back and turned back to Nehemiah. If you recall from studying the book of Ezra a couple months back, I had mentioned the fact that originally Ezra and Nehemiah was one book, and it wasn't split into two different books until long after it was originally written. Both of the books concern the return from exile after the judgment and destruction from God on Jerusalem. And we must not forget that whenever we talk about the fact that it was God that initiated or prophesied, I should say, the destruction of Jerusalem, that he did so as a result of a judgment upon the people of Israel. The 10 northern tribes had already received judgment through the people of Assyria. The two southern tribes, it was longer before God judged them, but the time had come in which God was going to judge even Judah and Jerusalem for their wicked ways. And so we must not forget that God had sent the prophet Jeremiah with the news of warning and then the ultimate decision to destroy the city of Jerusalem. And it's also kind of a reminder at the same time that one, that the city ultimately belonged to God. It was his. He made it, and the temple was his temple. Even the people of Israel belonged, not to themselves ultimately, but to God himself. And so I think that as we think about the fact that God specifically prophesied ahead of time the destruction of Jerusalem, it shows, in my opinion, his love, his mercy, his grace, but it also, in my opinion, demonstrates things about himself, and demonstrates, whether it was to those people at that time or to the Jews later, like those that we're going to see here in Nehemiah and we saw in Ezra, but even years later and even today, to me, that when you can go and you can read prophecies of things that God is going to do, and then it does take place, what a reassurance that is when it comes to the promises he's made to us. He's a God that means what he says and says what he means, and he keeps his promises. He's faithful. And so I think that these prophecies, even though when Jeremiah came to speak them, I'm sure that Jeremiah wasn't thinking in the back of his mind that, wow, in the future, that this is going to be used to justify God. I'm sure he wasn't necessarily thinking about that. Matter of fact, later we'll talk about the book of Lamentations, which Jeremiah writes after the destruction. And what's on Jeremiah's mind, well, as the title of Lamentation says, is his sorrow of the destruction that took place. He wasn't rejoicing at the idea. But we today, as we look backward, we can look at that and we can see that God is justified in his doings, but also it justifies that he is God. He's the authority, meaning he does speak what he's going to do, and he does tell us in advance. And let that be a warning. As we, Christians today, when we want to evangelize and we, get to that point in a conversation with a person about why they need to be saved, we could talk about how to be saved, but oftentimes a person wants to know why they need to be saved. What do I have to be saved from? Well, Paul says that God has appointed a day in which he's going to judge the world by that man. And there's a day of destruction coming to man. Well, just like Jeremiah prophesied, there's a destruction coming. What ended up happening? That destruction came. And so I think these books, we see in Romans that these things are written down for our learning. And so we understand that things took place that we're not told about, which is why I can't wait to get to glory. One of the reasons, because I want to find out some of the missing pieces of information. It's not that we're without necessary information. We have all the information we need, but there's details that aren't included in here. But the fact of the matter is that we have details in here that are meant to both encourage us, to warn us. And we ought to just be thankful that we have this. The author of the book of Nehemiah is, in dispute by some. I think that the very first verse here says the words of Nehemiah, the son of Hagiai, suggests to us that Nehemiah is the author. And I think it's possible, and at least certainly feasible, that Ezra is the one that compiled this, maybe took some of the writings that Nehemiah, I don't know. But there are certainly those that would suggest that Nehemiah didn't write it, Ezra wrote it. But whatever the case is that the text itself seems to suggest that it was Nehemiah, and not just from verse 1, but there's also the use of the word I at times. And I, in the context, is Nehemiah. And so that would suggest to us also that Nehemiah is the one that is the author here. Nehemiah himself, we don't know a whole lot about him. We know that he was presumably born in exile, meaning he probably wasn't 100 and some odd years old. Therefore, he wasn't probably born in Jerusalem. And so he was probably born in exile. He was a cupbearer for the king in Persia, which makes him a very high official. We don't necessarily think of that. Sometimes we may watch a movie and it may show a medieval king, and you have these different people that come before the king, and you may have a cupbearer or whatever, but let's keep in mind, access to the king was highly restricted. If you had access to the king, especially the kind of access that a cupbearer had, you were in a privileged situation to have that direct kind of access. And so he was certainly a high official. And as we're going to see here, and we'll talk more about it when the time comes, he's distraught after he hears the news about what's going on in Jerusalem. And what does the king of Persia do? He inquires about the mood of Nehemiah. And so, you can kind of see that there was, a level of relationship there. I'm certainly not going to suggest they were friends or anything like that, but there is this aspect that he has this privileged position. We don't know really anything about his family or his background. We get the name of his father and the name of his brother during this book, and but we don't really have anything else that we can go on. So we don't know much about him other than he is a high official, and based upon the things that we learn from the book itself, you can tell that he's somebody that loves the Lord. He understands the law. He understands what it means to approach God and to do so humbly. And so there are things that we can learn certainly about his character throughout this book, but as far as knowing, there were things that we knew about other people like Ezra that we just don't have that information about Nehemiah. The date is generally, and I always want to caution whenever it comes to giving dates in the Bible. If we don't have a specific date specified in the Bible, oftentimes the date is trying to combine biblical along with secular history to try to come at a date. And so take it with a grain of salt. We do have some specifics in here, but it seems as though that the events of Nehemiah are going to take place between 445 and 430 BC. So that's 445 to 430 BC. And specifically, the book of Nehemiah begins about 12 years after the events concluded in the book of Ezra. And we'll touch on that again as we look at some of the other aspects of this introduction here. But ultimately, the events that we finished off and in the book of Ezra, it's been 12 years since then to the beginning of this. All right, that's some of the facts that we have about it. Background, whenever you combine Nehemiah and Ezra with Esther, which, keep in mind, it's believed that Esther takes place during the 60 years that takes place between Ezra chapter 6 and chapter 7, I think it is. And but when you combine these three different books, it completes what is called the historical books of the Old Testament. And that historical books is a term in which man gives it. God doesn't call it. This section is the historical books. But we often find that especially theologians and commentators like to break things down into nice, neat little summaries and outlines. And so basically the first 5 books, Genesis through Deuteronomy, is considered the books of the law, which even though you don't have that in Genesis, you don't have the law until Exodus, but hey, people like to break it down as simple as possible. The next 12 books after Deuteronomy, which would be Joshua through Esther, are what's considered the historical books. So these books really give us an understanding of the history of the nation of Israel and help us to understand a lot of the things that have taken place with them over the years. The other 2 sections is broke down between major prophets and minor prophets. Now, 2 of those minor prophets we've talked about when we were in Ezra, because 2 of those minor prophets are contemporaries with Ezra and Nehemiah. And we talked about that last time when we were in Ezra, the prophets Hagiai and Zechariah, which I would suggest to you, if you've not read them, do so. And combined, I think there are combined 15 chapters, if I remember right. And so it doesn't take long. And if you're studying Ezra and studying Nehemiah, understanding what these 2 prophets are speaking about is relevant, because prophets don't speak because they decided to just speak for themselves. They speak because God told them to speak. And so during the days of Ezra and Nehemiah, we have God sending prophets to the people of Israel with a message. And so in order to round out the revelation when it comes to these times, you really need those 2 books to understand what's being, what's important to God. It's in Hagiai that we see that there was opposition in the book of Ezra to the rebuilding of the temple. Remember, they built the altar, and then they began to build the temple, and because of the opposition, they stopped. Well, in Hagiai, we see God's thoughts on that. And he sends Hagiai with the instruction to tell the people of Israel, get busy, let's get going. And obviously he says it much more eloquently than I say it, but that was the gist of it. It's the whole idea is that you need to get back to building the temple. And so Then in Zechariah, Zechariah is a very fascinating book because there are things in it that are certainly, relate to the time, which I just said, but they're future prophecies, that still haven't taken place. And so, very, very interesting book in that regard. Zechariah basically calls the people of Israel to return to the Lord. He calls for a mercy and justice. And these things are important because as God judged the people of Israel and scattered them, He promised He was going to bring them back again. And so God is He's not just simply allowing them back in the land. He's trying to rebuild something here. He's trying to take a people that was broken down and destroyed because of sin, because of rebellion, and because of their continual wicked ways of serving other gods and rejecting Him and all manner of sin. God judges them, but He wants to bring them back. And it's not just enough to say, okay, here's a land, here's a temple, here's this, that, or whatever. No, there needs to be a call for them to change their ways. And so there's a call in Zechariah for them to return to the Lord, a call for them to have mercy and to have justice. We have prophecies regarding the future temple in Jerusalem, which is very relevant because as we see here, the temple being rebuilt, you see the prophet Zechariah coming and he's telling them about, those who are building this second temple, he's telling them about a future temple, a third temple. Now, what would be relevant about that? Well, that would tell them that something's going to happen to that second temple too, wouldn't it? It would tell them, it's almost like an unspoken warning at that point right there. That, hey, there's going to be a third temple, and that means if the first one got destroyed because of sin, we're building the second, and there's going to be a third. Well, I think you can read between the lines. But he's got prophecies regarding the future temple, which is also very interesting because there's some differences in that future temple versus the first and the second temple. And I won't tell you what those are, but I think that I would suggest to you go read that. In there, Zechariah discusses God's judgment on Israel's enemies, which is very pertinent because Israel at this time, the nation of Israel, they are still basically a state under the authority from Babylon, the Persian king. He's the one that's ultimately in charge. And even though they're being allowed to return, they're not being allowed to rule themselves ultimately. They have certain latitudes, but in the end, it's not, complete separation from them. And so here Zechariah comes and he speaks to them and he prophesies of God's judgment on Israel's enemies. We learn throughout all of this that as the people of Israel were scattered into judgment, and there were still some people in the land that didn't end up getting taken. We read through, whenever you read some of these writings, we find out that you had people like the Edomites and you had others that were just laughing at the nation of Israel and what took place to them. Now, obviously, the Jews probably took that quite personal, but God took that, I think, quite personal as well. And so God says that He's going to judge the enemies of Israel, and it's ultimately because they're His enemies. In Zechariah, we have lots of prophecies regarding the future king, meaning the Messianic king, Christ the Messiah. We have future prophecies on that, which, by the way, turn with me, an interesting one when I was doing this. Turn to me to the book of John. John chapter 19. Verses 36 and 37. This is a verse that, almost anybody's familiar with. John chapter 19, verses 36 and 37. It says, "For these things were done that the scripture should be fulfilled, a bone of him shall not be broken. And again, another scripture says, they shall look upon him whom they pierced." Most of us are very familiar with that reference to that the Jews will one day look upon him whom they pierced. This is, John 19 is talking about the crucifixion. Well, notice what it says here. He mentions that these were done that the scripture should be fulfilled. A bone of him shall not be broken. Well, that's a reference to the book of Exodus. But where do you suspect verse 37 is a reference to? It's a reference to the messianic prophecies in Zechariah. Turn with me to Zechariah, chapter 12. Zechariah, chapter 12. Look at verse 10. And I will pour upon the house of David and upon the inhabitants of Jerusalem the spirit of grace and of supplications, and they shall look upon me whom they have pierced, and they shall mourn for him as one mourns for his only son, and shall be in bitterness of him as one that is in bitterness for his firstborn. So what John is talking about in John chapter 19, when it says, as it is written that they shall look upon him whom they pierced, that's a reference to Zechariah. Zechariah, contemporary, he's one of the prophets who's going. So imagine, put the imagery in your mind that as Ezra and Nehemiah, as we're going to see when we get to Nehemiah chapter 8, Ezra and Nehemiah are in Jerusalem together. And around this same time, at some point, Zechariah is coming to Israel and he's giving these prophecies. And so that's why I say when it comes to, as we look at Nehemiah, go read both of these prophets, Hagiai and Zechariah, to just kind of get a feel of the things that are being talked about and told to the people at that time. They probably don't understand what Zechariah is saying. I don't even know if Zechariah understands what Zechariah is saying. It's not even a prerequisite, is it, for a prophet, for him to understand it? He's just told what to say, and he goes to say it. And so, just very, very interesting, if you ask me, whenever you think about the different dynamics and the different nuances of what is taking place at this different time. You cannot convince me, you'll never convince me, that man on his own wrote this book. It boggles the mind to think that man could do this. So, combined with these two books, these Ezra and Nehemiah, it tells the story of three very key leaders. And again, just kind of a summary before we get into verse by verse of Ezra and Nehemiah. But Ezra and Nehemiah details three key leaders, and really you can say four if you really want to say it. But basically you're going to have Zerubbabel. You remember him in the first part of Ezra. But he also had Jeshua with him. So it was Zerubbabel and Jeshua. Jeshua kind of sometimes gets left out, but he was a very important aspect of that initial group of 50,000 people that came to Jerusalem. So you also have Zerubbabel and Jeshua, but then you also have Ezra and Nehemiah. So these three really key leaders, these two books, which again, at one time were one book. Zerubbabel and Jeshua, if you recall, they led around 50,000 people to return to Jerusalem from Babylon, and they set out initially to build the altar. And you remember that? We talked about the fact that, you can have an altar and not have a temple, but you can't have a temple without an altar. You have to have the altar. And so they searched for where the altar was supposed to be, and they looked for the right place. They built the altar, and then they set out to build the temple. 60 years later is when Ezra, he will bring a few thousand people, and he comes to teach the Torah and to reestablish worship. The people of Israel at that time had, without going into too much detail, they had many issues. Even though they were back in Jerusalem, even though they had the altar, even though they had the temple, they were severely lacking in a lot of things. And Ezra comes to reestablish worship and to teach the Torah. Remember, Ezra was called a ready scribe, which meant that he was a very learned and capable scribe. So you had Zerubbabel. 60 years later, you had Ezra, and then 12 years, as I said earlier, 12 years after the end of the book of Ezra. Keep in mind, and as I'll touch on this in a minute, both Ezra and Nehemiah, if you really look at them, you know, it's very interesting because both of them somewhat end on, well, kind of a downer situation. And when we left off with Ezra, remember what was going on? They were intermarrying and marrying with other people, and Ezra had to put an end to that, and you know, they hopefully was restoring that situation. Well, so again, 12 years after those events is when Nehemiah comes. And Nehemiah, his purpose, so to speak, is to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. So you had the altar restored and rebuilt, you've had the temple rebuilt, and now Nehemiah, he's going to hear about the situation in Jerusalem. It's going to make him mourn about it, and he is going to go back and rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. Now, I intend to, potentially anyway, when we get, maybe even next week, or when it seems appropriate, I might pull the TV over here and show you a graphic of those walls. You're welcome to look them up yourself, but I do have some images of both drawings. And if you go to Jerusalem today, where they've done excavations, you can see parts of the wall in which Nehemiah had rebuilt. They're still there today. So very, very interesting. And so what we've are going to see as we read this book, that even though the people of Israel had been back in Jerusalem in total for about 90 years. So from the time in which Ezra 1 starts with Cyrus, and the word of the Lord came to Cyrus, and Cyrus was convinced to let Zerubbabel go back. From then until now, the beginning of Nehemiah, it's about 90 years. And that's why I was saying, most likely, Nehemiah wasn't born, prior to the exile, because that had been, 160 years, because what's 90 plus 70? Because the exile was prophesied to be 70 years. So it had been 160 years. So chances are Nehemiah wasn't born there. And but it's been 90 years, and since they had been back, the temple has been complete for over 70 years. Okay? But yet, as we're going to see here, in Nehemiah 1:3, look at this. Look at how the situation in Jerusalem is described. And we'll go back and read verses 1 through 3 in a minute, but I want you to read what is described to Nehemiah, the status. And they said unto me, the remnant that are left of the captivity there in the province are in great affliction and reproach. The wall of Jerusalem also is broken down, and the gates thereof are burned with fire. And so Nehemiah had asked what the situation was. And again, it's been 90 years since Zerubbabel took people there. And it's been 70 years or so since Ezra had been there. The temple had been built for 70 years, and Ezra, the one who went there to reestablish worship and to teach the Torah and all of this, he had been there for 12 years. And this is what we're seeing the situation is that there's great affliction and reproach. So it's not just that it says the remnant there, the wall of Jerusalem is broken down and the gates thereof. We see this statement that the captivity there are in great affliction. And I think that one can speculate on what is being suggested there is affliction from outside people. Because remember, when the Jews went and wanted to rebuild the temple, they faced opposition and it got shut down. As we're going to see when Nehemiah goes back to rebuild the walls, do you think the surrounding communities are going to welcome him? No. So, this could obviously be a number of different things in regards to the affliction and reproach. I always caution us to be too much into, as we talked about before, about the book of speculation. We got to be cautious about that. So, I think that this great affliction and reproach, simply by the mention of the walls, is at least due partly because of the walls, meaning the mention in connection there suggests that it's somewhat related, that the status there is beyond just a spiritual situation, but an actual physical situation as well that is a problem. So that's a little bit of an overview, but a little bit more of an overview of the book of Nehemiah itself, so that you kind of know what we're going to see through this book. Again, it's been 12 years since Ezra, the book, ended. Nehemiah is going to ask about the people in Israel, the people back in Jerusalem. And he doesn't get a good story or understanding of what's going on. But the result of him finding out what we just read is that Nehemiah is devastated. He's not just angered by it. I don't believe that he's just angered, that he's just sad. I think he's devastated to hear about this. And because of that, he's going to pray, as we're going to see here. Half, if not more, of chapter 1 is him praying. It's a prayer of his. If I remember right, and this is going by memory, and so that means, 1, be warned. We're going on my memory. And 2, go check it out for yourself. If I remember right, there's no less than 10 prayers in the book of Nehemiah. So let that be a point for our taking there. But as he learns about the situation, he prays, he confesses. He not only confesses, much like we saw in Ezra, we talked about this, he not only confesses the sins of the people in Jerusalem, but he confesses his own sins. And so he's going to confess. He's going to petition the king, which is kind of, a daring situation to petition the king. And in the result, he's going to end up going back to Jerusalem. He's going to inspect the walls, and he's going to rebuild the walls. And in chapter 8, he's going to work with Ezra. And basically, they're going to work to try to bring about a spiritual renewal. Because believe it or not, man tends to be stubborn, and we don't tend to learn. And even though the people of Israel had been judged, sent to captivity, and then brought back, and then rebelled in Ezra's day, they had rebelled against God, and Ezra finds out about it, and he deals with it. Guess what? Did that fix the problem? No, that doesn't fix the problem. It wouldn't have fixed the problem if we were there. If we're honest. We wouldn't have fixed the problem likely if we were there. But in chapter 8, he works with Ezra, and they try to bring about a spiritual renewal. And so they basically spend 7 days reading the Torah. And then they celebrate the Feast of Tabernacles. They have confession, and then they vow a new, what's the word I'm looking for here? They vow themselves to the covenant again. They basically call upon themselves to adhere to the vow. And then you get to chapter 13, which is the final chapter. And in chapter 13, Nehemiah had left Israel and went back to Babylon. But in chapter 13, he returns and he finds the people once again had forsaken the Lord and forsaken the vows. So, I don't know how many times that is, if we're counting that the people had, said that they learned their lesson and then, went the wrong way again. But ultimately, I think that's one of the lessons here. People like to assign, well, what's the purpose of the book? And I don't like to answer why questions too much. It's one of the things that irks me when it comes to Bible teachers. Why this is set in here? Well, unless the Bible tells me why it's set in there, I want to be very careful of telling you why it's set in there. Certainly ascribing a purpose. But one of the things that I think that we can learn through this, there's a number of things, but one of them is that the people of Israel, and not just the people of Israel, all people, in order for them to lead a victorious life that's pleasing to God, I don't care what dispensation you're in, you need to be transformed. This is why Paul, for the body of Christ, he says that we need to transform our minds, is what he says. And that the only way that we can live a victorious life is if we truly understand the grace message. And I don't mean understand the doctrine, but understand that the grace can fulfill things that the law never can. But for the people of Israel, for these people, as we see how the people had rejected, rebelled, and confessed and returned to the Lord, and this continual cycle, it's not an accident that the two prophets prior to these events, Jeremiah and Ezekiel, both prophesy of a future day when there's going to be a transformation for the people of Israel. The whole new covenant, the idea that God is going to write the law into the hearts of Israel so that they can actually do what it is they're supposed to. It's no coincidence, in my opinion. And so people wonder, why is it that you have the book of Ezra and the book of Nehemiah? Sure, it tells about the return, but look at the events. It's kind of like, it certainly doesn't make Israel look any better. And I think part of the reason is so that, it's pretty obvious that for a person to live a life pleasing to God, it's not going to happen because you're determined to live a life pleasing to God. You're going to have to be transformed by the renewing of your mind and the renewing of your heart. That's what I believe one of the things that can be learned of this. Another thing I think that you can learn from both Ezra and Nehemiah is that God keeps His promises. As we talked about before, God had told Jeremiah that He was going to scatter His people in judgment. He was utterly going to destroy Jerusalem, but that He was going to bring them back. And so we see that God is faithful. Is that encouraging to you? Again, some people, why are we studying the Old Testament? That's deal with Israel, not for us. Well, because there's things that are so vitally important for the encouragement for the body. And we can understand and be encouraged that God is faithful. And so I think this also is fodder. This is tool in our tool belt. When we, who rightly divide, we understand that there's a future messianic kingdom. There are those that want to suggest that the kingdom is now, that we're trying to build the kingdom and that this is the kingdom. No, this isn't. God had promised. He had Jeremiah that He was going to bring the people of Israel back to their land. Then He later promises that He's going to scatter and bring them back again. If He kept this one promise, why would we suppose that, He's not going to keep the next one? Or that somehow it was changed? No, so I think that it's a very important lesson there. But as I said, we see that both Ezra and Nehemiah end with some letdowns, and I think that it instills in us the understanding of what's really going to change us is not a second chance. I'm about second chances, and I know God's about second chances, but you're fooling yourself if you think a second chance is going to make you a better person. The only thing that's going to make you a better person is God doing something to transform your life. And I think that that's what we can learn from this. The people of Israel, they may have obeyed for a period of time, but in the end, guess what? Man is sinful. And if man does not if he's not intentional about directing his path, it's kind of letting go of the steering wheel when you're driving down the road. Let's just see where it goes. Who's going to trust in that? Well, same thing. One of the things that also I think that we can get from this is how to respond to the Lord. Meaning, the people of Israel, as many mistakes as they had made, the one thing that we do see, though, is that when Ezra, whether it's Zerubbabel, whether it's Jeshua, whether it's Ezra, whether it's Nehemiah, comes and calls them to task, for the most part, the people of Israel respond right. Whether they do, they say they're going to do, they express obedience. And I think that's an important lesson for us to learn, that when God has called us to the truth, we need to remember that the things that God has called us to do, we need to do. We need to do that. A simple outline, if you're trying to outline the book of Nehemiah, is chapters 1 through 6 and chapters 7 through 13. 1 through 6 being the reconstruction of the walls. chapter 7 through 13 being the reinstructing of the people of Israel. So 1 through 6, the reconstruction of the walls, 7 through 13, reinstructing the people of Israel. It's kind of a simple outline that'll serve you well if you'd like to outline. All right, any comments or questions before we get into the verse by verse here? All right, Nehemiah chapter 1.
I would just comment that it's interesting you mentioned about Jews and their relationship with God, and how over the centuries, really, they've it's just interesting that I've heard it said that they're God's chosen people, not the chosen people, and they relish in that, I think. But at times, they realize that they've not been obedient, and they like the status of that position. And it shows in their politics and their tenacity in that region to be such a small nation, and like a land, holding that chunk of land in the Middle East, etc. And that's another aspect to the Bible that could not be written by man.
Right.
You know, they're that nation and the survival of that nation.
Sure.
And the people and those people.
Yeah, because there are people that certainly have been the object of desire for destruction by majority of the world.
Right.
And so, and it's interesting that they exist, but again, that they will in the future exist obviously as well. So yeah, I agree. Nehemiah chapter 1, let's read verses 1 through 3 here. The words of Nehemiah, the son of Hagiai. And it came to pass in the month of Kislev, in the 20th year, as I was in Shushan the palace, and I won't go into some of these details like I often would, like, you know, the fact that Shushan was considered to be one of the palaces of the royalty there, and it's actually, you can do your own study on it. It's quite an interesting place. Susa is another name for it in the Bible, and it's got some aspects to it that are pretty interesting for you to check out. That Hananiah, however you say it, one of my brethren came, he and certain men of Judah, and I asked them concerning the Jews that had escaped, which were left of the captivity, and concerning Jerusalem. So he asked about the city, and he asked about the people there, and they said unto me, the remnant that are left of the captivity there in the province are in great affliction and reproach. The wall of Jerusalem also is broken down, and the gates thereof are burned with fire. And so in verse 4, which we'll read in a minute here, we can begin to see that Nehemiah's reaction to this, again, he's devastated by it. But what's so important about the walls is one of the things that we might first ask ourselves. Why do they've got the altar back, they've got the temple back, they've been allowed to return back to the land, they're able to do their sacrifices again, they're able to do their singing again, they've got their priests, and yet here we have the mention of the walls in such a way that it certainly seems to be putting an emphasis on the walls to whatever degree. And if you read some commentators, they're going to speculate that the walls is somehow a suggestion of God's blessing, and so the fact that they don't have walls, it's almost as if God's withholding blessing, or it shows that they haven't had God's blessing, and that type of thing. And I'm not really going to comment on that, but to say that I think that there's more to it than that. And because one of the things that I see from Nehemiah as you study this book is he tends to be a practical person. He seems to be somebody who's looking on some very practical things. And so we know that walls, are, especially in that day, are very important for safety, right? They didn't have air forces, So generally, if you could keep the ground force at bay, you were going to be safe. And so walls was going to be the primary ways for safety. And so one of the things that you might, I think may help us understand why the people would be in this state, talk about this great affliction and reproach and why the walls are such a big deal. Whenever you study the Persian history, things that we do know from history, things that have been written down and accounted for, we know that Egypt, because the Persian Empire is vast. I mean, it's huge. It stretches through much of that Europe area all the way down into Egypt, through Jerusalem and down on through Egypt. In 460 BC, Egypt rebelled against Persia, and there was an uprising. And it took a number of years for the Persians to put that down. And then, not only that, you had in Mesopotamia in 448, you had you've heard us use the term satrap. They're officials. We talked about them in Ezra. You had a satrap in Mesopotamia who also rebelled in 448 BC. So even though you were Persia, it's kind of like in Rome. Guess what? You may have been the big guys on the block, but you still had a bunch of guys that are always willing to take swings, especially on the outskirts. And so if Persia has enemies and you're going to attack Persia, you're probably not going to go into Babylon and do it. You're probably going to do it in some of these outlying areas, which Jerusalem would be. And if they don't have walls, that would be a very, precarious situation. And so you would probably be pretty concerned if there's already been at least 2 rebellions of people, which ended up getting squashed. And if somebody was coming to attack and to do harm to Persia, and they chose to do harm in Jerusalem, there was little to nothing protecting the people of Jerusalem. They didn't have a standing army there. So there's a very practical reason why it could be that these walls would be a very important thing to have. Verse 4 is where we begin to see Nehemiah's reaction to this and his prayer. Let's see in verse 4. It says, "And it came to pass when I heard these words that I sat down and wept and mourned certain days and fasted and prayed before the God of heaven." And so here we can see that he's got a genuine care for the city. I mean, he weeps. It's not just that he's angry. It's not that, I think that he's, we today, we have allegiances to cities. Obviously, here in America, we tend to be pretty patriotic about the United States. And so if somebody was to attack the United States, or if there was, somebody causing harm, most people would not take too kindly to it. And so here he's got a genuine care for this city. But I would also tell you, it's possible that he'd never even been there. Again, he was born in Babylon, unless he was 170 years old or happened to be born while his parents were on a trip, which is possible. But in all likelihood, he was probably born in Babylon and may not have even ever been to Jerusalem. May not. But either way, he has this serious concern. I know that myself, I grew up in a suburb in St. Louis, so it wasn't in the city of St. Louis. It was a suburb about 20, 30 minutes away. And I can remember growing up there, and then years after I got older, many, many years after I left, I had the opportunity to drive back by there again, and going there and just simply seeing how it changed made me sad. I wanted it back like the way I remembered. It wasn't in destruction. It wasn't in harm. I didn't view it as good as it was whenever I was there, and it made me sad. And I've studied history enough to know that whenever you think of Civil War soldiers, and it's pretty interesting to me that we have online, you could read letters that soldiers wrote their families and families wrote their soldiers. And oftentimes, these men go away excited to serve their country, and then it's not too long after they get there, all they can think about is home. and thinking about the beauty and describing. You have Civil War soldiers from the north going down to the south and then describing the beauty of the landscape or where they were from, and just in mourning out of fear that they will never see that land again. And you can hear it in the hearts of these people. And it's kind of like this, where Nehemiah has this love and this longing for this city, and to hear about the tragedy of the situation is devastating to him. But there's a big difference between a northern city in the Civil War, a southern city in the Civil War, and even where I grew up in the Midwest. Jerusalem was and is different, because Jerusalem is where God himself lived. God himself, the Shekinah glory, dwelt there in Jerusalem. And if you know that, it's kind of, we were talking about this earlier, if you know the association of Israel as it relates to God himself, and you understand that history, and to hear what's going on, to know that position that Jerusalem had in your own, even if it's a selfish thing, because it's my people, to know that relationship and to see the situation just causes problems. Turn to the book of Psalms with me. Psalm chapter 137. This is believed to be a psalm that was written post-exile, meaning after they had gone into captivity. This psalm is believed to have been written, we don't know who wrote it, but it's believed to have been written during that post-exile situation. And let's read this and notice what it says. Psalm 137, verse 1. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down, yea, we wept, when we remembered Zion. Zion, as you know, is another name for there in Jerusalem, one of the hills in Jerusalem. We hanged our harps upon the willows in the midst thereof, for there they carried us away captive, required of us a song. And they that wasted us required of us mirth, saying, sing us one of the songs of Zion. How shall we sing the Lord's song in a strange land? If I forget thee, O Jerusalem, let my right hand forget her cunning. If I do not remember thee, let my tongue cleave to the roof of my mouth. If I prefer not Jerusalem above my chief joy. Remember, O Lord, the children of Edom, in the day of Jerusalem, who said, raise it, even to the foundation thereof. Believed to be a description of that whenever Jerusalem is being sacked by Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar comes and he destroys it. You had the people, other people, Edom, rejoicing, literally, calling them on to say, raise it, destroy it. Verse 8, O daughter of Babylon, who art to be destroyed? Happy shall he be, and it continues to go on here. But you can see in this idea, this longing back for Jerusalem, how can I sing here and rejoice and I'm not in Jerusalem? Jeremiah, I mentioned him before. Go to the book of Lamentations. Lamentations, again, is a book written by Jeremiah. So Jeremiah, the book Jeremiah has his prophecies and talks about the prophecy of the coming destruction. Lamentation is Jeremiah seeing what took place. And so here we have his sorrow of the city, hence the name Lamentation. Look at chapter 1, verses 1 through 8. How doth the city sit solitary, that was full of people? How is she become as a widow? She that was great among the nations, and princes among the provinces. How is she become tributary? She weeps sore in the night, and her tears are on her cheeks. Among all her lovers, she has none to comfort her. In other words, the idea here is generally that even though Israel at the time of their destruction had friends, they had, people that they would call friends and allies, but when she was destroyed, in the end, she was abandoned by all. She didn't have any more friends. She didn't have any more allies. She has none to comfort her. All her friends have dealt treacherously with her. They are become her enemies. Judah is gone into captivity because of affliction and because of great servitude. She dwells among the heathen. She finds no rest. All her persecutors overtook her between the straits. The ways of Zion do mourn, because none come to the solemn feasts. All her gates are desolate. Her priests sigh. Her virgins are afflicted, and she is in bitterness. Her adversaries are the chief. Her enemies prosper, for the Lord has afflicted her for the multitude of her transgressions. Her children are gone into captivity before the enemy. And from the daughter of Zion all her beauty is departed. Her princes are become like harts that find no pasture, and they are gone without strength before the pursuer. Jerusalem remembered in the days of her affliction and of her miseries all her pleasant things, and she had in the days of old, when her people fell into the hand of the enemy, and none did help her. The adversaries saw her and did mock at her Sabbaths. Jerusalem had grievously sinned, therefore she is removed. All that honored her despise her, because they have seen her nakedness. And the idea here is that the people, the Gentiles nations that would honor the nation of Israel, specifically Jerusalem, a lot of it had to do with the fact that the blessings that they had from God, the things that they were able to achieve. I mean, all the different things which we know in Israel's history, whether it's King David, Solomon, and so on. But ultimately what we're seeing here in this idea is that they were shown naked. Well, nakedness is basically not being clothed, not being covering. Israel was naked because God allowed their enemies to come and destroy Jerusalem. There was no protection. And the people saw that. That's what this is talking about. Because they have seen her nakedness, yea, she sigheth and turneth backwards. Turn to chapter 2, Lamentation chapter 2, verses 1 through 8 here. How hath the Lord covered the daughter of Zion with the cloud in his anger, and has cast down from heaven unto the earth the beauty of Israel, and remembered not his footstool in the day of his anger. The Lord has swallowed up all the inhabitants of Jacob, and hath not pitied. He hath thrown down in his wrath the strongholds of the daughter of Judah, and hath brought them down to the ground. He hath polluted the kingdom and the princes thereof. He hath cut off in his fierce anger all the horn of Israel. He hath drawn back his right hand from before the enemy, and he burned against Jacob like a flaming fire, which devours round about. He hath bent his bow like an enemy. He stood with his right hand as an adversary, and he slew all that were pleasant to the eye in the tabernacle of the daughter of Zion. He poured out his fury like fire. The Lord was an enemy. He hath swallowed up Israel. He hath swallowed up all her palaces. He hath destroyed his strongholds. He hath increased in the daughter of Judah mourning and lamentation. And he has violently taken away his tabernacle, as if it were of a garden. He hath destroyed the places of the assembly. The Lord has caused the solemn feast and Sabbath to be forgotten in Zion, and hath despised the indignation of his anger, the king and the priest. The Lord has cast off his altar. He has abhorred his sanctuary. He has given up into the hand of the enemy, listen to this, the walls of her palaces. They have made a noise in the house of the Lord, as in the day of solemn feast. The Lord has purposed to destroy the wall of the daughter of Zion. He hath stretched out a line. He has not withdrawn his hand from destroying. Therefore he hath made the rampart and the wall to lament. They languish together. Do we get the idea that God judged the nation of Israel, and when he did it, he utterly turned over all of the things at which Israel, counted as their rights and their privileges and their position. And so we see here that Jeremiah, he sees this destruction, this devastation, and this is his reaction to it. And so whenever we see back in Nehemiah, Again, there's no evidence that Nehemiah has been to Jerusalem, but he's certainly got a heart and he's got a care. He certainly seems, based on the things that we see from here, he's somebody that knows the history. He knows, the privileged position that Israel had, and whenever he hears, because think of it. If you're Nehemiah, and you know that 90 years before, Zerubbabel went back and started to rebuild the altar, the temple. Ezra goes back and he's getting the people in order. When you get this report, it's devastating. And so this is why he's devastated. And we'll next week, I had hoped to get through all of chapter 1, but next week we'll actually read what his prayer is, and because there's some very interesting parts of that, and possibly even get into chapter 2 next week. So any questions or comments?